bring on the comment section. I have my adult fizzy boobala get me through this video. Hello plant people, how are you guys doing today? If you're new around here, my name's Ashley and I'm a soil scientist, and usually on my videos I like to take that science and apply it to gardens and plants. However, the number of requests I have gotten to do this video is insane. Emails, DMs, comments on YouTube videos begging me to talk about this topic. And normally I steer away from politics because, let's face it, both sides have extreme people that are absolute lunatics. Expecting a A++ comment section, try to keep it PG. YouTube's gonna block the comment anyways if it's nasty enough, so just keep that in mind. What I will say though is, if you are worried about climate change, this is not enough. If you are worried about the food crisis, this is definitely going to affect you. If you are worried about the GDP or federally, you're in trouble. So this will affect people in Canada. This will affect people outside of Canada. It's ridiculous. It's just poor, and we'll talk about why that is. So I think one of the best ways to actually look at this is the history of what exactly is going on. So back in 2020, I had this kind of document scroll across my inbox where one of our ag equipment guys was like, hey, by the way, this is coming into effect. And back then, there was some messaging on it, which I will read to you here and explain why there's a slight disconnect compared to what was said in the initial write-up versus what currently is going down. And I think you would be shocked at how many notes I took on this, because I want to get this right for you guys and give you a really unbiased, clear look at both sides of this topic. So the government statement is, the Government of Canada has been clear that the objective of the national target for fertilizer is to reduce emissions, and that the primary method to achieve this is not to establish a mandatory reduction in fertilizer use that isn't linked to improving efficiency and maintaining or improving yields. Rather, the goal is to maximize efficiency, optimize fertilizer usage, encourage innovation, and work collaboratively with the agriculture sector, partners, and stakeholders in identifying opportunities that will allow us to successfully reach this target. So, what is the target? The target is a 30% reduction in fertilizer use. This is going to affect organic, and this is going to affect synthetic equally. So, regardless of what side of the fence you're on, permaculture or conventional, you're in trouble. The issue is that what has now come out in 2022 as a goal, again, not a mandate. So the disconnect between now and what was said in 2020 is this: the emissions formula being used. So the formula is emissions equals fertilizer by volume times by an emission factor. Now, the emission factor is not adjustable, and this is where the problem lies. Emissions lost through the soil, which is what we will talk about here in a little bit on the video, is caused by a number of different factors, which can consist of soil moisture, the future soil moisture that is going to be laying that year, the type of bulk density of your soil is, the texture of your soil, farming practices, whether you're tilling or not tilling, and a number of other factors, organic material, you name it, will all reduce or increase that emissions factor. The only adjustable portion of this equation is the fertilizer by volume, and this is what's upsetting farmers. So I think we should lay some ground rules here. Farmers are not necessarily these old men that are 60 to 70 years old. Farmers now look like me, young women and young families in many cases. Now, there are very large farms that, this is not going to affect, but my family farm, for example, it can affect, because we're a ragtag crew of people that work full-time jobs and literally farm as a hobby just to help keep that family legacy going. And there is a number of farmers in Canada and the US that are kind of following this lifestyle. So why do farmers feel like they're being attacked? Well, the number one reason why they feel like they're being attacked is because they're being assumed to not have already been putting in the minimum amount of inputs. a farm is a business. So if you can reduce your costs, and one of the best ways to reduce costs, because it's not cheap, fertilizer is really not cheap when we're talking about doing thousands of acres every single year, potentially multiple times a year, it can get very expensive. So we're always trying to reduce that footprint. So I wrote down some ways and some farmers that I know personally that utilize these to help reduce the fertilizer input. So they typically will utilize a professional, an agronomist, a soil scientist, someone that works for their fertilizer company, or someone that has their own private company that deals in this field. And those people always, 9 out of 10 times, follow the 4 R's, and that is the right time at the right rate with the right source and the right placement. So there's a number of different factors that kind of encompass that, but ultimately the goal is always reduction, and they will utilize professionals who will test the soil, look at past harvest maps, will even take into consideration topography, soil moisture, and the actual soil texture to determine what's too much and what's too little, and always go on the side that's going to be best for the earth. The other thing that farmers are upset about is that they don't get credit for legumes, they don't get credit for using inhibitors, manures. Very common for farmers to spread manure on their land, by the way. People think conventional farmers don't do that. They do all the time. Humic acids are now being used. They do split applications, and they invest tens of thousands of dollars in sectional control, which, to anyone who doesn't know what that is, it's essentially the ability to take an 80-foot drill or a 60-foot drill, sometimes it can be 100 feet, and each section, there can be up to 8 sections, there can be as few as 3 sections. Each section can be controlled individually according to a prescribed application, meaning if the drill is going across the land and there's an area that is more heavy clay versus sandy soil, it will shut off the fertilizer to the clay areas and only apply it to the sand areas. It can even turn things off for soil moisture. Say it's going through a really damp spot, it will turn off the fertilizer and it will only apply in the dry areas. And it can even work with topography. So if you have, a hill and there's a certain area that the depression area, you don't want to apply fertilizer, you shut the drill off, or you shut off that section. So you can see how much time and effort they put into minimizing the fertilizer inputs just to begin with. You combine that with a drought year from last year with a really, really poor harvest pretty much across Canada, flooding in some parts of Manitoba this spring where they weren't actually able to get the crops in at all, and the now carbon tax that is ever increasing, that they get absolute zero carbon credits, despite the fact that an acre of wheat can sequester up to 5 tons or 10,000 pounds of carbon in an entire season, and wheat should be planted absolutely everywhere. Every ditch in the city should have wheat in it rather than freaking grass, but I digress. They're upset. So what's the bad guy here? It's actually one in specific that the government is after. So nitrous oxide is actually a byproduct of microbial activity. So yes, those conventional farmers actually have microbes in their soil, and those microbes will release nitrous oxide. I will set another ground rule here. When I'm talking about inorganic versus organic, I am not speaking in terms of organic farming or inorganic farming. I am referencing organic, meaning a compound that was alive at some point and is very large organic molecule, versus an inorganic single molecule or element. So keep that in mind. So the entire nitrogen cycle has a lot of microbe activity. Nitrogen is being mobilized and immobilized, you name it, and it's very cyclical in pattern. Now, unfortunately, nitrogen in its inorganic form is incredibly unstable. And the reality is that nitrogen in its inorganic form is the form that plants like to take up. So microbes are going to decompose that nitrogen organic source or inorganic source and always convert it into inorganic for plant uptake. The problem becomes is that same form of nitrogen can be leached into the ground, or it can be volatilized, gassed off into the air in the form of nitrous oxide or ammonium gas. Now, synthetic fertilizers do have more inorganic N up front when compared to organic if it doesn't have a slow release or some sort of coating on it, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But regardless, that form of N is really readily available. So because of that, synthetic fertilizers do gas off more than that of organic. The issue from an environmental standpoint, if you are at all interested in this from like an ecological perspective, is that if a farmer tries to cut corners and use sow slurry from the goons, a pig barn, or if they try to use composted manure, what they will do is they will apply to the nitrogen level, which will leave an excess of leachable, water-soluble phosphorus, and that phosphorus will end up in the waterways, which will just pollute the waterways, and it's just going to be a trickle-down effect of just more shit, for lack of a better term. So how do we reduce nitrous oxide? What are methods that the government could use that don't necessarily involve a volume reduction and that the farmers should talk about, and what Canadians should encourage the government look at? So the first one being stabilizers, and this is the one that my day job is getting called about because there's a whole kit that goes on. It's like $30,000. You can put it on and it will add stabilizers. What the stabilizers do is they stabilize the nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen, and basically put it in a slow release formation. Now, what I will say is if you are a farmer and you're watching this and you're looking at this as an avenue to go with, I heavily encourage you talk to a professional in regards to equipment and product. This stuff, in some cases, depending on the type you're using, is incredibly corrosive. It will eat all the seals in your sectional controls. It will eat the seals in it. If you're dealing with a gas, it will eat out the veins and your pump will be destroyed. So please talk to a professional before choosing what brand you're going with, along with what equipment you're using to apply it. And never ever mix it in unless you're allowed to, unless the professional says you're allowed to. Never ever mix it directly in with your fertilizer. Again, it will just ransack your entire cart or nurse wagon if you're using one. It will just destroy it. So while these sound nice and pretty, urease inhibitors, the reality is that they're not. The only one that is not corrosive and I wouldn't be worried about putting in my soil would be the coating version. The issue with that is that sometimes these coatings are done on site and people don't have the proper mixers. Anyone who's done this before knows how sometimes it's done with a cement mixer, because I've done the cement mixer version before for other things. But the reality is if the urease inhibitor is not perfectly coating the granular and there's like little pinprick holes in it, it will just ultimately still, the water gets in and it's game over. The second method is through coating. So you can purchase slow release nitrogen as a farmer, urea slow release. It's green rather than white, and this will work just fine. It's just a slow release version. Now, the reason why this is so great at actually reducing the amount of nitrous oxide released into the atmosphere is because the less inorganic N immediately bioavailable, the less that is gassed off, and the longer it can sit in the soil until the plant needs it. Because the reality is that seedlings don't need nitrogen. They want phosphorus and potassium in the beginning. It isn't until about 2 weeks in a lot of cases that the plant actually begins to use the nitrogen. So if we can get it to sit there, hang out, not be eating away at those darn microbes, we can postpone or reduce the nitrous oxide that is lost. Then of course we can do things like split applications. So again, this is just another way of reducing the amount of inorganic N immediately available in the soil by doing a fall application and a spring application. Now, of course, with the carbon tax and everything else, people are a little less interested in doing this. The less you run the equipment, the better type thing. I don't think people realize how expensive it is to run a tractor. It's not cheap. Yes, it's not cheap. And then of course we can use those sectional controls to turn fertilizers on and off to just reduce the volume applied in specific areas that may not necessarily need it. So what does this mean for you? From a climate perspective, it's a shit deal. You'll be yielding smaller plants, and smaller plants means less carbon capture. Less carbon capture means less carbon will be sequestered. And if any form of inhibitors are being used, you are potentially harming soil microbiology. If manures or organics are used and they are applied at a rate to supply the N, but it's not taking into account the phosphorus, we could end up with eutrophication. So the reality is it doesn't solve any issues at all. Ideally, what would happen is we would apply N to the amount that the crop needs in order to provide a lush crop that can sequester huge amounts of carbon while also feeding the world. Obviously, food crisis, smaller plants, lower yields, you name it, it's not going to be good. And we would take a really big focus on incentivizing farmers to upgrade their technology. So give them incentives to use an agronomist, give them incentives to upgrade the sectional control equipment to the latest and greatest, add more sections, for example, things of that nature. From a food security perspective, this is scary because the cash crop here is canola in Canada, in most of Canada. And because of that, if people need to make ends meet, they are going to seed the crop that makes them the most money, which will be canola. Now, canola can be used for oil, so you can buy canola oil for cooking. However, it's not obviously wheat and barley and oats and all these other crops that we eat on a daily basis. Now, the other problem is that there is a biofuel mandate in Canada where we want to add ethanol to fuel. Nothing wrong with that. It's completely okay to do. The problem is that it takes away from human grade consumption food, because if we have to add so much ethanol to our fuel, the ethanol has to come from somewhere, and the local source, or the source for the world in reality, is Canada. From a GDP economic perspective, it's really bad news. I actually wrote down some stats about this because I was even shocked. It's estimated, and this is a statement from Fertilizer Canada. It's estimated that a 30% absolute emissions reduction for a farmer with 1,000 acres of canola and 1,000 acres of wheat stands to have their profit reduced by approximately $38,000 to $40,000 annually. There are 153 million farmed acres in Canada, and so you can very quickly see how that's going to affect our economy. There's jobs in food processing, there's jobs in trucking, there's jobs in trains, there's so many jobs in moving high volumes of food around this country. And so if you think, oh, it's just going to affect those farmers, it's just going to affect those silly old farmers, it's not. It's going to be a trickle effect of absolute insanity that takes place. So, I don't know. If Trudeau, you're watching, which I know you're not, trying to get me kicked off YouTube. Anyways, that's a joke. That was like a reference to Bill C-11. But I just, seriously, if anyone's watching, the truth is that fertilizers being decreased is not going to help the climate if proper professionals and technology such as soil testing, etc. and so forth is being used. Now, I don't know many farmers that don't deal with a professional on some level, so I'm pretty sure that box is checked for the most part. I think there needs to be a big focus, and I think the government needs to really, really look at the technology side of it, really trying to hone in and make those inhibitors better than what they are, and fostering what they said they were going to foster in 2020. The idea of fostering tech and research and implementing new ways of farming to help with climate change and actually making this massive amount of land in Saskatchewan have the ability to work in taking some of the bad stuff out of our air should be the goal. Not sacrificing food yields. And there's so many ways to do this without punishing farmers. So there's, you know, you could incentivize regenerative ag, you could incentivize, you know, legume crop intercroppings. There's ways, you could even go as far as, like, from a tech standpoint, anyone out there, if you're smart enough to be able to figure out how to basically separate different size grains through some sort of a sieve system on a large scale so that farmers can intercrop without the stress of potentially having to give it all to feed, intercrop legumes with wheat and canola, like do a 3 crop system all in the same field. I've seen it done. The issue becomes whether or not they can separate the seed, and if they can't separate the seed, it goes to feed. And so obviously, you know, there's some hesitation there, but just really fixing that side of things, I think, would go a very, very long way for a enormous amount of people. So with that being said, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. Thanks for reaching out. I appreciate the fact that you guys respect me enough to even ask me this question, and I will talk to you guys next time. Bye.